welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today, we have Dr. Joshua Krug. He is a visiting professor focused on Jewish studies in Heidelberg, Germany. I cannot for the life of me pronounce the full German name of the university program, so I will let him introduce himself, his background, his work in the Middle East and Jewish studies, and tell us a little bit about your work before we delve into the program. And the program, of course, focuses on Dr. Krug's recent media contributions. They're linked to the current war in Gaza, the dilemma over the ongoing diplomatic effort to bring about a ceasefire and why that is dragging on. But it will take a slightly different tack from a lot of these discussions, focusing less on Netanyahu and or for that matter, even the administration, US administration pressure, and more on Yahya Sinwar and his ability to manipulate public opinion and manipulate the political system and these diplomatic efforts. Thank you so much for joining us.
Lovely to be with you, Irina, this evening. And just for the sake of teaching some German, I will share that it's the Hochschule für Jüdische Studien, the Institute for Jewish Studies over in Heidelberg, Germany. Lovely to be with you.
Thank you so much. So let's start from the beginning about a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? What kind of work do you do as part of your current effort, and more generally as well?
Lovely. So I'm originally from Los Angeles. I spent a lot of time in New York and the East Coast. And I've been in different kind of spheres of Jewish studies, academic Jewish studies. I've also been in Jewish education. So I've played different roles over the years. I've become that much more interested in geopolitics and diplomacy over the last several months. I've been, since October 7th, been that much more, intrigued by how important, politics, societies, nations, dynamics between countries are. I want to also note that I have a background in Islamic studies and Middle Eastern studies. So I studied Arabic in Jordan, and I traveled around the Middle East. I've really had a lot of privilege to be able to go to different places to kind of get a sense of culture. So I can tell you stories from Egypt, from Lebanon, in a safer time than today.
I mean, that's fascinating, especially given the increasing links we're seeing between education and geopolitics, from the protests on university campuses in the US, Europe, and other countries to the funding of education by Middle Eastern and also other actors such as China and even South Africa. We are seeing that education and this particular field and the region seem to be inextricably linked these days, and I'm wondering whether that's had any impact on Jewish studies per se.
It's a good question. One of the things I'll say is that my main focus is the question of coexistence, the question of how there can be peace. There can be peace in the world. And I know it sounds like this naive thing to mention in a time like this, where we're in a situation of war, and it doesn't look like anytime soon there's going to be, everyone holding hands or whatnot. But I do think that there are those forces in this world we live in that want to fan the flames and in some way are encouraging hatred, encouraging animosities and resentments. And so there's the question of what's happening today and tomorrow, whether or not there's a ceasefire. And then what's going to happen next month, next year, next decade. I mean, next century, but let's not get ahead of ourselves here. Education is part and parcel of everything. The question of how, let's say, Israel is represented in Palestinian schools today, how people are taught, how different societies teach about the heroes in their cultures and their societies. Ultimately, what will lead to coexistence. That's my main focus and my main interest. And so you're right. You're right. We should focus on kind of where the money comes from. I think that's a valuable question in general. I want to make a distinction, though. You mentioned the college campuses. I think there are those folks who are animated by a desire to do something to enable, children or whatnot in harm's way from dying. There are those folks, and then there are people who I think are sort of manipulating those folks who actually their interest is not necessarily as simply in the humanitarian questions of supporting the well-being of children. Their interest is in completely other things. So one of the things that I've been thinking about is what it actually looks like to care about people who are in harm's way, to actually say, how can we help you? How can we support you? And not to support this narrative or that narrative, but rather because you're a human deserving of dignity and choices. So what I'd like to see is I'd like to see Israel and its neighbors get along. And again, I realize that can sound like I'm living in my own reality in my head, because there really have to be a lot of changes for us to imagine that situation. Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned China, you mentioned Russia, they're involved too and have their own interests with it all. I mean, Russia over in Ukraine, China has its own interests and desires in Taiwan, wants to make the world in its own image, wants to set itself up as against the United States, and challenge American power. So there's a lot of dynamics that we're sitting with.
You touched on a very important point, which is the issue of manipulation, the manipulation of some of not just college students, but the narrative itself. And that brings me back to this issue of ceasefire, this word that has become a sacrosanct in today's discourse about Gaza. Interestingly, you have the word ceasefire entered this discourse before Israel entered Gaza. And the question is, how is it that the ceasefire folks who have been calling for ceasefire before there was anything to seize, really, how is it that it hasn't become apparent within those few weeks that these guys were trying to prevent Israel from destroying Hamas before there were even any discussions of civilian casualties in Gaza? What is it about this magical word ceasefire that has somehow become so successful in grabbing attention before there was, any action to respond to, really?
Great question. Yeah, I would say ceasefire as a word sounds great. It sounds pro-peace. It sounds pro, human well-being. It sounds pro-human rights, pro-individual rights. It sounds like no one wants to look at the news and see things that make them feel sad, make them feel angry, make them feel powerless. We want to feel like we can do something, and indeed maybe we should do something to make a difference. Ceasefire as a word, as a phrase, evokes, maybe positive associations with people, and a lot of those things they could be true. I mean, with a theoretical ceasefire, I mean, I don't want to, you think about the ceasing of fire in different wars over the course of history. The war ceased, and then there was a gateway towards coexistence or peace. In this context, a lot of the actors using this term are using it as code, but not necessarily sharing that code with the people who are protesting, or with all the people protesting. The code is, in fact, ceasefire as time to rebuild one's military capabilities. Time to plan the next October 7th, time to attack again in the future. So I often say, and again, I know I often say, well, what about if there was a call for peace? I don't hear that call. I don't hear a call for peace. Why not? Again, there are many reasons why not. I give my take on that, but I think you're right to focus on rhetoric. And the uses of rhetoric and the manipulations in relation to rhetoric. So Yeah, so those are just some kind of initial comments that come up.
Now, sticking with this word ceasefire and why it has become so important, Israel and Hamas were in fact in a state of ceasefire, not peace, but ceasefire, before the October 7th attack. And right up to that moment, Israel was under the impression that this ceasefire was a lasting ceasefire. There was not a peace deal because, as everyone who's ever looked at Hamas founding charter would find, Hamas is dedicated to the destruction of the state of Israel, and they were not going to change that position. But for whatever reason, the ceasefire carried on. And this was not the first ceasefire. Hamas and Israel have had many conflicts, and they've had various ceasefires, and eventually all of those ceasefires were broken. Now, given this historical context of ceasefire, given the fact that the state of ceasefire was in fact violated by Hamas, let's kind of revisit this question and ask ourselves, all right, so Hamas violates the existing ceasefire. Hamas attacks Israel, attacks civilians, abducts hostages for the very purpose of being able to finagle a military advantage with the use of these hostages. That was the whole point of the abduction. So how is it that this word ceasefire still has not been discredited given this historical context? And I'm not talking about the malicious actors, of course. The malicious actors will use any means at their disposal to bring about their desired ends. I'm talking about the well-meaning general public that continued following this line. What is it that they don't see about the status quo, antebellum, and what happened immediately thereafter? Why is it that they are not blaming Hamas for violating a ceasefire, and they're not
Sure.
demanding Hamas to return to a state of ceasefire and to lay down its arms first?
Sure. First of all, I would say for Hamas, because they undermined the existing, you could call it a ceasefire, the existing situation on the ground, for them, in their world and the world that our world, I mean, to survive is a victory. To survive is a victory. And on the level of public relations, on the level of reality, they want to be able to say, look at us, we defeated, or we made Israel look weak, the great military power, the one who seems so amazing and it's not going anywhere. Well, we brought them to their knees. And by surviving, they can claim that. So I would just note that, at least that's my take in that regard. Yeah, no, your question is very important. Why haven't we as a culture, in our discourse, folks in media, etc., why haven't we, asked better questions about the use of that word or troubled the use of that word? I would say various things are happening at once. One, quite disturbing, I think there are many people who are ultimately sympathetic to Hamas. They have been, I would say, ideologically manipulated to sympathy with Hamas. They say, Hamas, is fighting for resistance. These kinds of ideas. Ultimately, that's their view. It saddens me to have that analysis, but I do. The other thing that is very important here is that, we do have an ongoing situation of war.
Mm-hmm.
Some people, I think, erroneously call it a genocide, but regardless, what is obvious, or no one's really disputing, is that a lot of people are dying on the ground, including children and others, right? So in that regard, people want to do something, just people on the street or whatnot who have a heart. When they watch the news, they want to, advocate. So this is the language that's emerged to frame that advocacy. I think your question is so important because maybe there's a better word to use, but I want to step back. Let's, be frank about it all. The state of Israel is deciding to drop bombs in its pursuit of defeat of Hamas. I would say Hamas is responsible by embedding itself amongst civilian populations as one of its tactics, and one can think of, like, Hamas is ultimately responsible for its people. but the way that it behaves is such callous disregard for its children, its neighbors' children. But suffice to say, people, I think many people, when they look at the news, which is very focused on this and gets a lot of clicks, it focuses on, the challenges that civilians in Gaza are having, and the lack of safety. But the question is, what is the better word to use? How should we frame what makes sense in order to get a terrorist entity out of power, an entity that ultimately does not allow its own people to advocate for differing viewpoints, that has kept its own people hostage in Gaza for almost 2 decades. So that's the thing, when people on campuses are advocating in some way on behalf of or in sympathy with Hamas or somehow condoning it, the people of Gaza are not allowed to do that. They cannot express themselves in that way. It is dangerous for them. We're not talking about a democratic regime where, everyone can express their views and explore their personal take. We're talking about a situation of war in which people's lives are at risk. We're also talking about a situation of tyranny in which people are not free to express their views and indeed would be meant. My friend said, a Palestinian fellow, now he's based in Germany, but he was tortured by Hamas, and it was a horrible thing, and no one cared 2 years ago, but suddenly people care today in relation to what's happening, and fine and even good that people care about what's happening in the world, but it's the question of how do we land the plane? How do we enable the well-being of people who are in harm's way? How do we enable states and people to coexist? Those are the kinds of questions I sit with.
So, what you're describing right now is a case of Schrodinger's Hamas, meaning that on the one hand, the same group of reactive public audiences acts like Hamas is a legitimate state governing entity that has a responsibility for its people, despite the fact that Hamas spokespeople actually stated that the responsibility for the civilians lies with the United Nations, but it's being treated as a entity capable of entering into agreements, capable of engaging in deliberations and diplomatic discussions. On the one hand, the same people understandably get that a terrorist organization cannot be held to its word, and therefore put all their pressure, all their impact on Israel as a state, as a responsible state actor, to take this action. Now, this to me is, of course, not a logical response. It is, in many cases, an emotional response. So how do we approach this response where there's a clear cognitive dissonance between what is possible and what is, and what is actually a contradiction? Is there a way to make people see that, they cannot both consider Hamas, an entity capable of having discussions, and at the same time, as an entity that cannot be held accountable for its actions?
Yes, well said. I would like to see advocacy that is more interested in holding Hamas responsible for the choices they make. I think one of the things that we're seeing is kind of an interest in the accountability and responsibility of Israel. And ultimately, it has not served the people of Gaza, for example. What would it look like if there was a global campaign pressuring Hamas to change its tactics? I'm not saying that Hamas would want that. But we talk about the well-being of people. We talk about, human rights, the situation of people who are in harm's way. So that seems to me to be a really important angle to push. How can Hamas be pressured to kind of get with the times and to, I guess you could say, to normalize with its neighbor?
Can it? Because if it's that ideologically radical, why would it? But at the same time, you can't kill every potential Hamas recruit, first of all, because you don't know who exactly they are. And second of all, that means basically a forever war where Hamas is constantly recruiting and you're constantly running around trying to kill off enough people. And the more you kill, the more they recruit. So clearly there has to be some sort of a structure by which the leadership that is spreading this disinformation and recruiting people is not able to continue to hold any appeal to the general public. So the recruitment effort has to be somehow disrupted. But
that's right. And I think just to note a question with that, or a matter with that, is there needs to be some kind of vision for Gaza. In other words, until there's some kind of like, this is the end game, these states, these, international, we don't know yet, but like until there's that, who are people going to support? I wish, that people were, I would say, as mature or as thoughtful or as reflective as my Palestinian friend, who ultimately clearly desires and wants and is advocating for coexistence with Israel. But right now, Hamas is the de facto leader, and Israel is the military, seeking to, control everything. But what's the end game? Without that, I think, I don't know how people would be for something else, people on the ground. I also want to note, because you started with it, and I think it's an important part of the conversation. Yahya Sinwar is the leader of Hamas, and so with the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, power has been consolidated in the hands of Yahya Sinwar, who had been the head of the military wing. I think that this shows just how committed Hamas is to militarism and to fighting, you could say, to the death, although it depends what happens. It depends if there's going to be a ceasefire or something else. But, fighting, support for October 7th and that kind of, those kinds of tactics. This is called masks off. We know who Hamas is. We know what they're about. And I think I would like to see the international community, do actually what the American government just did, which is to say to hold responsible terrorists, for intentional and deliberate murder. I think of what happened with ISIS some years ago. That the global community advocated and banded together to just like stop an extremist regime. And it's possible to do regime change. And these are kinds of things that are very complicated and difficult. And I think in the last decades, these kinds of practices have not necessarily yielded the fruit that some people imagine they would. I'm thinking of Iraq and Afghanistan, but if you just as an example, if you think of history as well, you could think of, what happened in Europe in the middle of the 20th century. That was a situation of regime change. Ultimately, in Germany, let's say, where, a completely extremist leadership was stopped and was replaced by another leadership. So we have yet to see what will happen. I have my own hopes. I have my own horse in the race here. But, these people are very smart. They're very strategic, and they're very manipulative.
So let's look at that for a moment, because right now, U.S. never negotiated with al-Baghdadi. They never considered negotiating with al-Baghdadi. They killed al-Baghdadi and whoever they could, despite the fact that all these people came in with controlling women and children and abducting Yazidis and doing to Yazidi women and families exactly what they did to the Israelis. And so, nevertheless, here we are having a very strange situation. We have terrorism charges against all these leaders, Sinwar and so forth. At the same time, they're continuing to negotiate with this entity, despite the fact that this entity literally is doing exactly the same thing as what ISIS has done to Yazidis. So there is zero difference in tactics, methods, or for that matter, a long-term agenda. The agenda is not a two-state solution. The agenda is destruction of Israel, and Hamas is a much closer to ISIS ideologically because, in theory, they also subscribe to a caliphate, or at least an Islamist government, a religiously controlled government of whatever happens. So
Yeah.
let me examine this. We have this unclear signaling policy. So what would someone like Sinwar take away from this strange inconsistency in the approach? If Sinwar, someone who's an educated person, he's not simply a thug running around with a gun. He's someone who received education in Israeli prisons. What would be his takeaway looking at this policy?
I mean, I think that his takeaway is survive,
Mm-hmm.
both himself and the organization that he leads. I think that he has a perspective that time is on his or on Hamas's side. Drag this out as long as possible. You know, I think he sees that in terms of foreign policy and strategy for him, for Hamas, for the goals that he has. You know, you can look generationally at how people in different ages, in different societies, how they feel about Israel and Palestine and those kinds of issues. I think he ultimately feels like a lot of the leadership of the world is spineless in the sense of, you know, you're kind of making your hashtag on Twitters, you're making your posts. Oh, Hamas should disappear, but also we should have peace. It's like, what are we talking about here? Like, what exactly is this? That's not what Winston Churchill said. Now, I don't know what these leaders know. I don't have the diplomatic or strategic knowledge of exactly what's happening on the ground, and they of course have their own strategic needs, and are doing a lot of things all at once, including politics. There are elections coming up in various societies, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I would note that yeah, I think from his vantage point, surviving is a major goal, and dragging it out, and using the hostages as leverage, controlling the narrative. It's shocking, what just happened a few days ago, the murder of these hostages, these young people who had survived for like almost 11 months, and they were just murdered and shot. And it's interesting as well how, like, looking at various kinds of responses, I think so many people say we need to have a ceasefire now because look at how the well-being of hostages is just, they're not safe. I think there are great arguments to be made for that, frankly, to be made for, saving the hostages. But I also think it's certainly not obvious that's the right move if the same people who you're doing business with, you're talking with, tell you they want to do another October 7th the next day and the day after that until eternity. They're not saying, we're sorry, we made a mistake, we realized we did the wrong thing. That's not what I'm hearing at all. I'm hearing the opposite. We're emboldened. We're going to do it even more. They need to learn. We're going to teach them a lesson. And I would also say, we were talking about language and rhetoric. There's been this line of ceasefire now, but now you also have a completely different hashtag that I've heard. So there's this hashtag bring them home, or bring them home now, with reference to the hostages. So now a hashtag is bring the war home. I don't know if you've heard of this. So it's
not yet. What does that even mean? It doesn't sound good. You don't want to be fighting the war on your turf. That's the basic strategy.
It's a reference to we need to have, I don't know if you've heard this expression, globalize the intifada.
Yes, of course, that
It's
occurred too
a
many times.
reference, yeah, to we need to have kind of that sort of experience here in the United States or elsewhere in the West. We need to bring it here. You know, the arguments, the fighting, the struggle should not merely happen over there in Gaza, but indeed should happen on the streets of New York City and the streets of London and elsewhere. Again, I always want to note there are very important differences between advocates for the well-being of children, you know, who are ultimately in danger versus people who are, I think, very sinisterly, you know, wanting to inflame tensions and wanting to contribute to a situation of war. And I think we need to kind of have that in our minds. But there are definitely people who are excited for more quote unquote struggle and resistance against Israel, you know, and so I'm hearing that. So, you know, your question about these tensions, I think, is very important. How can you say ceasefire now, but also bring the war home? It's like, what are we talking about? It doesn't make sense to kind of hold both views at once. So I think that a lot of what we're seeing is, you know, people cheering their side. You know, I want my team to win. And there's not a reference to or an account that is like ultimately consistent about how can we support people, how can we enable the well-being of everyone, how can we support children in harm's way, et cetera, et cetera. I think that a lot of what we're seeing today in terms of the discourse, the conversation is like this side or that side. Are you pro or are you against? To my mind, in my head anyway, I consider myself to be pro-peace, pro-coexistence, pro-Israel, and pro-Palestine. That's how I consider myself, you know? So anyways, I think there are those voices that I think are looking to, you know, inflame the tensions. They feel you have to choose a side. And anyways, there's a lot of challenges in this current moment. But I'd like to see a way for Hamas to get out of power and for a better leadership to exist, to come to fruition in Gaza, and for Gaza to be like Singapore. I mean, that was the dream 20 years ago when Israel, you know, did the disengagement plan to allow folks there to do their thing, to have self-government. Ultimately, you know, again, hindsight is 2020. That was, you know, that was foolish. That was unstrategic as a move, or at least the choices that were made after were foolish from that level. But I mean, what would it look like if the world said, you know, like, turn swords into plowshares of people who want to kill, you know, find a way to support life, peace, coexistence, getting along together. I know I sound crazy, but what would it look like if, you know, Gaza becomes one of the wealthiest places on earth? How can we build that? I mean, that's the kind of, I think, broad vision and visioning and thinking that we want to have. And also to kind of ultimately make terrorism not a choice that people would choose, you know, make terrorism uncool. You know, you could call it freedom fighting, make that uncool.
So you bring all of this to a very interesting point, and I'll get back to the ceasefire and a couple of elephants in the room in a moment. But one point is that this vision of governance for Gaza, what are the potential models? And so far, we've heard a couple of versions. One, the Palestinian Authority takes over Gaza. Two, clans who are not affiliated with Hamas, families take over Gaza. Three, there's some sort of a combination between local governance and security slash quasi-governmental forces from regional powers. Now, while all of this was being debated and each side had its merits and arguments, what happened was Hamas concluded a unity deal with Fatah and de facto Palestinian Authority, and Hamas has strengthened its presence in the West Bank, benefiting from an influx of weapons from Iran. So all of that gives far less motivation for Fatah/PA to kind of distance itself from Hamas, because now they have this unity deal, and simultaneously strengthens Hamas' hand outside of Gaza and Iranian control outside of Gaza. So all of these options are now becoming de facto irrelevant because Hamas is actually while it suffered heavy losses in Gaza, it has, first of all, it hasn't been eliminated in terms of human capital, even if its weapons were eliminated for the time being, and Israel probably cannot stay there indefinitely. And on the other hand, you've got a growing presence and less motivation for regional powers to come in, because now you've got more Hamas members, most likely, and also a situation in the West Bank. So given that reality, and by the way, lest we think that Fatah will have some moderating influence on Hamas, not if they are weakened as they are, and not if they continue this in the same direction, which is also building ties with Iran. And during the Manama conference under Trump, there was this sort of plan to bring Palestinians on board the Abraham Accords, have an economic plan. Abbas rejected it, and anyone who tried to come to Bahrain for the conference was assaulted and beaten up and arrested. So the question is, given this practical reality, what exactly are we discussing here? Is there a vision that's possible given these factors? Who would be a leader in this reality? How could you even identify leaders given this consolidating control from multiple actors, some of which are external to the region?
That's $1 million, billion, trillion dollar shekel dinar question that you're asking. I mean, yeah, that whoever knows the answer to that, yeah, that's a really important question.
I
And
mean, I feel like
definitely,
current discussions are ignoring this reality completely,
right,
and are talking about abstractions that are not tied to the actual situation. Right? It's like I
sure,
talk about nothing, you know.
right,
So what
right.
should even be the goal under current circumstances? Some are saying Israel should forget about Gaza for now and focus on Hezbollah, but that still leaves the West Bank situation with Hamas unclear. And let's not forget, once again, the unity deal that will allow Fatah to transfer weapons to Hamas, especially if Israel withdraws from Gaza. They no longer need to look to Egypt because they can get weapons from Fatah.
So I mean, I'm basically sidestepping your question. I'm doing it with knowledge. It's a great question. But I want to say that I think my vantage point, and this kind of does rely on my background in education, is like the challenge that you could say Israel has, that the kind of the world has, is we want order. We want the shipping lanes in the Red Sea to go. I mean, the challenge we have is both how to stop threats, like dangerous threats to like well-being and security of people around the world, that are just, if people are in danger, how can we stop someone from, shooting a gun? Literally, you need to have a police to protect, you need to have an army to, there's that, but then there's a kind of a whole different, you could say, whole different dimension, which actually, frankly, makes this even harder, which is how do you set up a society or a region for coexistence? How do you educate for the day after? And I think that set of questions and those sort of issues, they need to go hand in hand with the first matter, because what I fear is that for various reasons, which I'm glad to talk about, like you have a situation where maybe Israel sort of sees itself as a hammer, and so all it sees is nails. And indeed, there are so many nails, and that's a society thinking about security. But ultimately, there are not only nails, right? And so this is about Israel. It's about the West in general. It's really about any country. How do they both make terrorism or make the struggle like uncool, but also protect people in the here and now from danger? And let me articulate this in action, like how it looks in practice. Protecting your people could involve unintentionally hurting, injuring, killing people who are in the way, who are being used as human shields. So, and then someone involved with that, someone who's the brother of someone who was just killed, says, I want to be a martyr. So it's like you wanted to stop the stop the resistance, the someone coming to kill you, but ultimately, you know, you maybe also unintentionally, I don't want to say cause someone to go and do it again, because I think the issue of cause and effect is something we should think through. People are making their own choices. They're not like, you know, they're not, they can think about their own decisions, but I think that's what we're sitting with. And it makes your question even more challenging. I didn't answer it. But I think that is the question that needs to be asked. And it needs to be asked in a serious way. And it needs to be asked by the most serious actors, the adults in the room. And it needs to be
Who are
asked
the
within...
adults in the room? Because I don't see them. I don't see them in the US. I don't see them in Israel. I certainly don't see them among the Palestinian leadership. I don't even see it, you know, among regional actors who are essentially just, you know, spouting their own versions of propaganda, but are not really proposing any workable, practical approaches.
So then allow me to say here, well, maybe the two of us and a lot of other people need to come together, and we need to figure it out, and we need to be involved in precisely this. If the people who are supposed to be responsible for the well-being of society and of the world, if they're not doing it right, then we need to figure out a better way. I mean, there are many people, for example, who are critical of the United Nations for, as but one example, allowing Iran to be the social chair of the human rights. And you know, the Human Rights Council, it's kind of remarkable that that's the case. But like, so if the international order isn't working, or isn't working in this way or that way, then what can people do who care? Both citizens, but also, you know, politicians and, you know, people who have like kind of influence in one way or another. How can there be mechanisms and processes for us to push for kind of to move the needle with all these things? And maybe it's impossible. Maybe the way I'm thinking is just sort of a waste of everyone's time, but I hope that there can be a way to make it better, to figure out, at least to get the unhelpful leaders out of power. I don't know exactly, but I think you're pointing to a broader systems challenge, a broader leadership challenge. Let me share with you this, because I think it's related.
Sure.
I wrote this piece in the Atlantic a few months ago, basically about how Palestinians shouldn't be trapped in their homeland in a time of war, just as Syrians and Ukrainians were not trapped in their homeland during a situation of war. And of course, well, there's a different experience of history, different experience in relation to land and what it means to be on the land and to live there or to leave and not to be able to return. There's a whole history there that you want to be attentive to. But I said, people should not be forced to potentially become quote unquote martyrs, i.e. dead. You know, that shouldn't be the situation. And my doctoral advisor, who I finished some years ago, but he shared, what makes you think that the contemporary leaders would listen to such a rational and like obvious idea? What makes you think that any of these guys would be like, sure? Like basically, you know, I think regardless of one's particular vantage point, it's like, if we could go back in time and help and find a way for more of the people of Dresden, of Germany, more of those people to not die, random kids, you know, in World War II. If we could do that, we would do it. It's just the right thing to do. It's like such an easy win. It's something that's like shocking to me that like not very many people have put forward as like an idea. Like it's so obvious, right? But in this situation, it's sort of like, it's so weird and so screwed up. So how can we make, you know, normal, I don't want to say normal, but how can we enable coexistence, existence?
I
You
mean,
know,
look, I'm going to respond to your question honestly, and
please.
I actually thought about it. I asked that question. I raised that question in discussions. But the clear idea is, and I am going to take away all the cynical agendas of various actors. I'm not talking about the cynical agendas. On a very basic level, Gaza has been radicalized. The adults there are not trustworthy. It is impossible to tell who has a real ideological allegiance to Hamas and who does not. The only out of pure security considerations, the only way people would go at least halfway to your point, was to you only evacuate young children under a certain age, but those children would then have to be literally re-educated. They would have to be placed in foster homes or some sort of group situations and re-educated. Who knows whether any of the parents would even agree to that, assuming that was an option. And second, that would even also be a risk because Hamas has been indoctrinating those children from childbirth, and many of them would also be potentially resentful of the circumstances under which they had to flee their homes. So essentially, there's a fear of a fifth column from society, which is not irrational. That doesn't make it not, not also a dilemma in terms of humanitarian, very real humanitarian concerns, but there is also the reality that when you allow ideological extremism to foster the way it has in Gaza, then there will be an issue of extreme levels of distrust.
I mean, I think your analysis and your sense of reality is unfortunately there's a lot there. I guess I want to have like the answer for this situation, but I think the logic that you share, the things you note, you can also use that to justify all kinds of things in relation to fighting in a war.
By the
And
way,
that's
I'm not saying that that is an excuse to not deal with that question. I'm just saying that these are the concerns. And as I said, I think it's still, offering an option of having young children evacuated. I don't think that's undoable. I think that should have been actually done in the very beginning because maybe some people would have taken that option, and those lives having had that option at least on the table, you could say, well, look, it was after we offered the choice, they refused, and now it's on them what happens, right? So at
right.
the very least, I think that should have been some sort of an option, and I don't think it would have been completely unmanageable. Having, a children's evacuation option of some sort, um, uh, and may have been actually positive on many levels. Even now, I think it's an option that could be
Yeah,
exercised.
I mean it's amazing in a way also, like, like it's fascinating to look at an ongoing situation of war. We're looking at history, like there's in the last few days there's been polio vaccinations,
And that actually
right?
brings me to the elephant in the room that I wanted to address. The elephant
Can
in
I
the
can I say one thing, or
Sure.
do you want to
Yeah, go ahead.
you were mentioning the challenge, the possibility of a fifth column. One of the things I wanted to note
Hmm.
is that like there really are some awesome, remarkable, beautiful souls, Arab, Palestinian folks
Oh,
who
I have
actually
no doubt.
really,
But
I know you
yeah.
know this, I know you know, who actually really like, they're just like in the Jewish language, we'd say mensches. They're just like great people. And so the reason I mention them, and a lot, like I know them, they're in Germany or they're in the United States or whatever. Like, what would it have looked like? What could it look like for folks like that who are involved with, the Council on Foreign Affairs and foreign relations, right? Like, what are people like that? What could they have done or what could they do? What I'm saying is like the notion that a bunch of Israelis would be running some camp or situation for Palestinian Arab kids under the age of 12, I think you're right. That's like a no-go. But
Hmm.
what might it have looked like for Seeds of Peace? This sort of coexistence training, camp,
Hmm.
or Palestinians who are actually just wonderful people, educators, thoughtful people, for them to take responsibility, for them to be trusted with that context. Again, it's both historical, thinking about the last months of war, and forward thinking, because they're really those people. My friend, he lost 60 of his relatives, including many children. He doesn't want any of them. He wants coexistence. He really
Hmm.
does. And I think, like, to empower people like that, I think that is a wonderful hope. I mean, and the other thing I would say is there are costs, important costs to the sort of thing I'm discussing. But I want to also note, and you've kind of alluded to it, there are costs to not doing it too.
Hmm.
There are costs to not, you know, fighting a war, or waging the peace, even as you wage a war, there are costs to not doing it that are really significant. And so how do we move the needle in culture? Again, I'm not saying I have the answer. These are really hard questions. How did the Nazis go from being the Nazis to being the Germans? And it's like there's a lot of things. It didn't happen overnight, right? But like those children who were in Hitler Youth became citizens of, they found their way, and many of them were, were anti-Semitic and had believed what they had been taught for their whole lives. But also many of them didn't go and shoot, people who didn't look like them or have the same skin color or whatnot. They were able to just live their lives without taking the action that their older brothers did when they were fighting in the war in World War II. So I guess I want to make distinctions. And the other reason I think it's important to make distinctions is because, I think that, right now you have this language from, you could say, pro-Palestinian voices. I don't even know that's the way to put it. Pro-Hamas voices of, well, look at Israel. They make everyone go into the army. They're all soldiers. They all want to hurt us. I hope they don't want that. I don't think they want that. But that's the logic. That's the language. It's like, well, they're all fair game. That's the language, that I think, and the rhetoric that is used to allow the dehumanization and the cruelty and the murder that we've seen. And so I want, again, ultimately I want the West to win in this war, and I want Palestinian and Israelis to get along and to coexist. I don't want them to lose with your hand tied behind your back, and it's not easy to fight a war. But I want to keep the values as that happens, because otherwise, what are you fighting for? You're fighting for your well-being, for your life and the rest. But I mean, that's the dynamic that I'm sitting with.
So I actually wanted to bring us to that elephant in the room that you also alluded to, which is the polio vaccine campaign. Why should there be any controversy about something so banal, mundane, and common sense? For one simple reason. I am not entirely sure that the whole story is exactly as it would appears. A 6-week pause for humanitarian reasons to vaccinate, civilians. The reason I'm saying that is because how did it all start? It started with one case of one kid getting polio, but then it turned out that in the last few years, there's been multiple polio vaccination campaigns, and according to records produced by Hamas, 2 million people were successfully vaccinated. This one kid, happened to not be, but there was no indication that outside a couple of, individual cases, there was a major risk, because there was also these past campaigns that already happened in the last few years. So what does that mean? It means that while that kid and whoever in his vicinity should have been vaccinated, this mass 6-long-week pause may have been a version of Hamas to get a ceasefire, without having to do anything, including releasing the hostages, which in my opinion would only have put them in a weakened position, because hostages are leverage, and if they release hostages, there's nothing stopping Israel from killing whoever they want to kill. So has Silver exploited this humanitarian fixation by Western powers, who basically put Israel in a no-win situation here? They basically had no choice but to agree to that pause, and had gotten a huge tactical win without having to do anything.
A good question. Possibly.
Because I don't see anyone celebrating Israel's humanitarian concession as any sort of PR victory for Israel. Nobody suddenly saying that, Netanyahu should not be arrested as a war criminal. The people who had that position continue to maintain it. Nobody saying, well, Israel is doing the right. I don't see anything good that has come out of it. I certainly don't have no way of measuring how many people are actually being vaccinated.
Yeah, I can't speak to exactly what's happening on the ground, right? I can say that for the almost a year's worth of babies, you're not going to have had vaccinations for those folks, for those little babies. So there's that. But I mean, what I'd like to see, again, is to note, I would like to see some way for leadership in Gaza to give way to some other leadership. Israel is making its own choices. So it's interesting. I completely agree. We need to focus on, Sinwar, the manipulator, and Hamas and its actions, but also Israel is making choices. If Israel isn't going to gain, the kind of strategic or, ideological victories or something in making a choice, then why are they doing that? I don't know, but they're making choices. I hope they have, good people who they're bringing in to advise them. Maybe they're not. I don't know. But what does it look like to be able to tell the story in a convincing way, in a compelling way about what you and your society are doing in a time of war? There needs to be investment in that kind of project. So what I mean to say is that I think there are a lot of factors that explain the sympathy that people have for Hamas, for folks in Gaza. Those are very different things. We haven't really talked about anti-Zionism in this context. We haven't talked about, that I think that for many people around the world, it is more interesting when it's the Jewish state who's doing something than for any other state. It's it's exciting in a sense. That's my read. There's that dynamic with it all. But Israel is making choices, and and it's hiring people or not hiring people. So how can they successfully tell the story of wonderful or good things they're doing? If they don't have good people or good initiatives, then they need to get them if they're doing great things. If they're not doing great things, that's another subject. But I think that they, I'd like to believe that that telling one's story, sharing what one is doing, can be compelling precisely on the level that you're noting it. You're saying, what do they gain by doing this?
I'm not saying that kids, young children should not be vaccinated just because you don't get brownie points for that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, is a 6-week pause necessary, given that the number of those children is probably, relatively limited compared to all the millions that were already vaccinated? And second, how can you do it in a way that, if Israel is going to suffer regardless of whether they do it or not, and if Hamas uses this pause as an opportunity to rebuild and cause additional problems, then Israel also has to watch out for the well-being of its own citizens.
Definitely.
It is not
I guess
just fighting PR battles for the sake of gaining someone's approval. I'm not saying that.
Sure. I don't mean to say you are. I would also note another factor in the mix here, and not an epidemiologist or something like this, but I mean, what about Israeli babies over the course of this time? And Israeli, what I mean is that, you have a situation of war, and you have funguses, and you have all kinds of things that happen in war in relation to spreading disease. And so maybe there's that component as well. Yeah, I mean, people, the World Health Organization, people have a right to their own well-being, and there's certain kind of standards that we have. I mean, if what would be, here would be my question: what's a way for people to not get polio in 2024, and for terrorists to not be leaders of their countries, or of their societies? Like, those things I would hope could go together. Those are such important things. It's like kind of things that I used to take for granted. And now I'm like, why did I take that for granted? Because the world is a crazy place, crazier than I imagined when I was growing up. That's for sure.
I mean, look, of course, you're right. In theory, doing positive things should include having, these Hearts and Minds campaigns an opportunity to show that you are not trying to kill off all Palestinians. Reality is, Israel does not have control over that population the way US and Western powers had over Germany during the denazification process. So until that happens, until that control is so complete that the entire infrastructure can be decontaminated from this ideological perversion, there's nothing Israel will do positively will necessarily make a difference in Gaza itself. Where it could make a difference is outside Gaza with appropriate messaging, which seems to be that's where there seems to be a failing. Then again, what the propaganda aspect of it, speaking of information wars, Israel sees this as a victory in that they did the right thing. You will have fewer people who are sick. That in itself is a victory regardless of public opinion. For Hamas, however, they don't think like normal human beings. Their ideology we got one over Israelis. We got them to stop military action without having to do anything in return. We are stronger, and they will use it not only for themselves, but for their own population to say, look at these idiots. We got everything and we don't even have to put our guns and we keep fighting for resistance. So this is the aspect that I think Israeli leadership should be thinking about. The fact that the messaging inside is being controlled and whatever positive they're hoping to achieve is not reaching the people. Precisely because of Hamas control in Gaza.
Sure. No, I think that's a very important point. But I would also say, calling attention to messaging, ideological information war, etc. But I think like, what is the plan for Israel and or the West and or in general, for you could say that kind of, I don't know, control or rethinking the narratives here, or thinking about who's trustworthy, who's not. And one thing that we haven't talked about so much in the conversation has been media over the course of the last several weeks and months, because I think there's been many times when media has kind of fallen prey, traditional media has fallen prey to certain narratives, believing what terrorists were telling them, right? So, and they've been wrong and they've been lied to. And then there's maybe a correction a few days later, like a very small print correction. But ultimately, what are the consequences for the media when they are themselves manipulated and duped? And what is the strategy for, let's say, Israel or the United States or others to enable ultimately coexist, like messaging that is pro-coexistence to succeed? What is the strategy for you could say, to undermine Hamas's efforts to successfully give propaganda that will be taken by so many around the world? There needs to be that strategy, that way of thinking, that investment, that creativity, to be able to combat a very smart, strategic, manipulative, like people with a very broad and long-term visionary viewpoint and ambition. And I imagine there's some happening. Don't get me wrong. I know a lot of people are thinking about these issues, but there needs to be better, because there's not merely the tactical side of war, and how many fighters still want to come and get you. There's also the narrative war, which is just as important, maybe more important in the midterm or long term. How are people thinking about reality? What is reality? What should we believe? I mean, so these are dimensions of reality that I would hope that our journalists can have savvy approaches to, and strategists, can be able to figure out how to combat. You also have cyber related, warfare too, the use of bots, etc., amidst all of this. And I think, Hamas was ready on all of these fronts, with technology, but also with economics. They shorted the Israeli stock market. They made a lot of money, right? There's all kinds of dimensions. So I think that, Israel has been on the defensive in that regard, but what can it look like to try to take the lead there? And I don't have, they're not easy answers to these questions, but I think they're essential questions.
With Israel, it's a whole separate story, and I do have ideas. for how Israel could take the lead. But I'll leave Israel apart for now, and I'll focus on actually the Hamas side of it, which is Hamas is benefiting from a couple of things. First of all, there is no media accountability, right? If New York Times is wrong, if they use pro-Hamas stringers in Gaza, nobody will sue them necessarily, and nobody will stop reading them and unsubscribe and massively boycott them and call them terrorist supporters. Nobody will investigate them for criminal for being facilitators of terrorist propaganda. U.S. does not do that. Maybe they should, but regardless of whether they should or shouldn't, they don't. So New York Times and whoever else, they're not going to suffer any consequences, and people will continue reading them on a regular basis.
Well, can I interrupt?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as citizens and as activists, because we have all the identities that we have, right? We can try to start campaigns to let people know about misinformation or disinformation, or about, why are you falling prey to this narrative? I'm not saying that suddenly everyone's going to believe what I say, because they're going to be asking questions about my trustworthiness.
Mm-hmm.
Who's this guy? Of course, they would ask that. But ultimately, we can advocate for truth, for the news, to reflect reality and to hold accountable and to empower a responsible news, telling of reality and framing of reality in appropriate ways.
Sure, but all
you're
of that
right. I
takes
mean,
time.
legally, I think you're speaking legally that like
Legally,
they're
or
not going to
even
be.
politically, or even in terms of reputational risk, forget even legal accountability. By the time you organize that campaign, your average newspaper or news channel, you'll have come up with 10 news stories that they don't have to be accountable for. Organizing campaigns takes time, it takes resources. These guys already have the resources, and they're with the 24/7 news cycle, they're churning out stories every 2 minutes before they can even fully digest the previous thing that came out. And it's impossible to follow everything and to follow every campaign. So they have that advantage on their side. So that's one factor that serves Hamas very well, and that they have been able to exploit.
I would also say, though, I would ask, and again, I don't have like the answer to such a question, but what could it look like for there to be a proactive and visionary approach to precisely the situation you're describing? By which I mean, what does it look like to have a leader, like a media leadership fellowship in relation to how to sift through news and social media to see who to trust? A kind of a context where you could affect people's thinking and you could affect what people believe or how people think. Again, that probably already exists.
Again, that's a long-term project. I fully agree with you. It's necessary, and maybe the funding is out there, and maybe people will learn their lesson. But all of that will take time to build in. What about now? The immediate now is that the media is being exploited at the moment, and they're not learning lessons from the past. They're continuing to use Hamas numbers, for instance, just as an example. They continue to use discredited narratives that have been proven by fact finders to be false. They are continuing to not amplify Hamas, the things that Hamas says about itself that would discredit Hamas with normal people. They actually hide that information. That's a choice. That's not just one stringer being a liar. That's an editorial line, an editorial decision, that goes beyond one bad source or a few bad sources. This is a choice by which they make the decision what to amplify and what to not amplify. That's an ideological decision. That's not them falling for bad information. So that's one aspect of it that Hamas is very much benefiting from, that such places, people are in position of power, and they are willing to be exploited in that way, and that they're not re-examining their choices, and they're issuing empty apologies and then continuing with the same narratives. And another issue that Hamas is very
Can
much.
I say one thing on that? Well, I guess, I also want to note there needs to be reasons, like one of the leaders of Israel's political and strategic sphere the other day was very seriously critiquing I think it was the IDF in relation to having knowledge of, you could call it a pogrom. I don't know exactly the words, within a place in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria called Jeet. You know, I think one person died, not a terrorist, right? So, you know, so in other words, why am I sharing that? I think it's important, you know, to, you know, I wish that wasn't the case. I wish that was a lie. I wish that I'm just making that up. But we have an ongoing situation where, you know, you have really serious trouble and challenges within, you know, we don't even have to talk about Gaza, you know, and I think the New York Times says we have a responsibility to tell that story, and they're often focusing on that story. So my question is, you know, that's an important story to tell, and how do you tell it, and how do you contextualize it, you know? But I don't like, so in other words, I think it's just important to note
do they
that
tell the same story from the other side? My issue is not holding Israel accountable for bad policies and bad things that happen. I have absolutely no problem with it, and I'm actually happy when Israel does investigate crimes, and I actually wish that the Netanyahu administration did a lot more to stymie extremism among certain segments of the population. Absolutely, and I've been calling for that publicly, and everyone who knows me knows that have no tolerance for that level of extremism. But
me also.
But what does the New York Times or another newspaper, or for that matter, the Biden administration, do they give equal time to the attacks by the Palestinians on the settlers, so-called settlers, which have emboldened, created a sense of impunity, and have helped the radicalization process there? If these people feel like the government is not protecting them sufficiently, if the international community is against them, if the US is going to be ignoring crimes against them and only focusing on them, will it not contribute to vigilantism and this sort of out of control thinking? Absolutely, it will empower the extremists, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think those stories should be told. And ultimately, as I've noted, it's okay with me to be someone repeating myself, you know, what ultimately leads to people being able to live side by side. You know, Arabs, Jews,
There needs to be equal level of transparency and accountability on both sides. And so far, I feel like only Israel is expected to act perfectly in times of war. And I'm not saying that people who commit outright crimes should not be investigated and put to prison. They should. But you should also not give, you should treat both sides in equal manner and not give this soft bigotry, of low expectation to the other side because they have bad governments. So, yeah, you have bad governments, but you also don't have to act, on your every emotional impulse, whether or not, regardless of your government. You don't have to contribute to the chaos with your own individual choice of action.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your point about the soft pedantry of low expectation. I think that's well put. You know, and as you may know, like the point of view would be, well, one of these groups is under occupation, and then it's sort of like, well, Israel's responsible for everything. I find that troubling and not convincing ultimately, because people are making choices, and like we need to focus on the choices they're making, and we need to think about what leads to coexistence. Yes, we need to have high expectations of everyone. You know, we need people to not kill each other. Ultimately, again, we're in this ongoing situation of war. So what am I talking about? But that's where we want to get.
But I want to kind of bring this back to Yahya Sinwar and what he has learned from his own experiences and how he's able to manipulate this context. And I wanted your opinion on that, because the terrorists are people who are able to turn kindness into weakness in the eyes of their supporters. And that has been the biggest benefit of their legacy, unfortunately, and I'm not sure how to reverse it. And here's the specific point. Yahya Sinwar was previously imprisoned. He got brain cancer. He was treated and cured at the time. He went into remission by a Jewish doctor. He was exchanged among thousands of terrorists who were released in exchange for Gilad Shalit. because of Israel's extreme devotion to saving hostages and saving human life. Now he's back claiming that it was Israel's obligation to help him get well, and he is under no moral obligation to not, be part of the axis of resistance and kill everyone, including the nephew of the doctor that helped cure him. Essentially, he's putting all the burden on Israel and no responsibility on Hamas, and his supporters are very convenient position. And he basically makes Israel look like useful idiots to other terrorists for caring about human life. And the that also plays into the other aspect of it, which is the release of Hamas prisoners, which now there is a burden of expectation to continue with that policy because it worked for Sinwar, it worked for him. He got released. Now you're seeing all these well-meaning people dissatisfied with Netanyahu for his various military and strategic decisions, adding unwittingly to Sinwar's perceived uh, interest in this by pressuring Israel to withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor, to go do whatever it takes to achieve ceasefire, to get these hostages released. And it's a very emotional topic, for the families and even for communities affected by the situation. But this is also empowering people like Sinwar who learn from this situation and who use the show of disunity not to play up how Israel is a democratic state with pluralism of opinions and diversity of sentiments, but quite the opposite, to discredit it as weakness. So everything Israel does that the West should be happy with because they're acting in accordance with Western morals and values, the terrorists are using in exactly the opposite manner, much to their success, and they are succeeding. The war has been ongoing for now, we're now in September, almost 11 months. Many of the hostages still have not been released. Hamas is still there. Sinwar, yes, a number of its leaders have been killed, but they have also been replaced. And Sinwar is very much a folk hero for many, and certainly continues to receive support from assorted groups around the world, not just Gazans. So the question is, he's learning all these lessons about exploiting morality, kindness, dedication to law and order and to justice, and to use it against, to weaponize it. How do you fight such an enemy?
Great question. Very interesting question. And I would also note as another example, he's weaponizing people's care for babies in Gaza, who are in harm's way when an Israeli bomb is dropped to kill, Sinwar's number 2, and that baby accidentally dies when the terrorist is right downstairs from that baby. And Israel is deciding to do that of its own volition, and if it's not strategically or tactically good for it, it shouldn't, right? But so that's the reality. But yeah, I mean, that is definitely an exploitation of morality that's like shocking to think that someone's parent or someone's leader would literally, as it were, sacrifice you for the cause, right? So they have their own idea of the cause, and your life. It's not that my job is to protect you, but my job is to, in a way, protect myself. He wants to live, Sinwar does, but also it's to, enable the well-being and the success of the cause over the well-being of people. So that's another example of what you're noting. How do you fight an enemy that exploits morality against you? I think that is the challenge of this contemporary situation. I think one dynamic is simply to see that for what it is, which I don't want to lose sight of that initial step, because I think a lot of people, it's ideologically or knowledge based, maybe don't even understand that's what's happening. Like that needs to be articulated as a meta narrative about what is this broader ideological situation, the situation of ideas and the conversation and how is Hamas using these what as you said, exploiting morality. So that just needs to be brought home in various channels by various people. I think there needs to be ways to not allow Hamas to get the quote unquote points that it thinks it will score. So in other words, this is why I'd like to see a pro-Palestinian movement that says your tactics for your people are wrong. Because strategically, I think that if there's a global movement that said, who are you to endanger your neighbor's child? Who are you, Sinwar? They wouldn't do it anymore. If there was a global movement that said you can't fight that way, it would be a different world. Now, we don't have that in a very loud manner, that vantage point. But if we did, can you imagine? I think it would be a beautiful thing for many reasons, including that those Palestinian 8-year-old kids wouldn't be in danger in the same way. Because I do think that in this sense, Hamas or Sinwar is strategic. If he's going to lose in some way in terms of media, in terms of, this sort of ongoing information war, if he's going to not benefit, then he wouldn't do it. But we have allowed ourselves to be manipulated and to be duped and to play into a certain narrative. So how can we say we care about the well-being of children and show our care, but not allow, the other side, as it were, or someone who's so manipulative to control the narrative. So that's something to say. And quite separately, and in a way, I'm not answering your question, but I think it does need to be said. I heard an interesting take on this one. I don't know what's right for Israel to do vis-a-vis these hostages. I'm not sure if they would be freeing someone who will go on to, do another October 7th. Is it make sense? I don't know. There's all kinds of ways you could think about the situation. But one argument for going through with the deal in some format, which is, I don't necessarily believe that's what should be done, if you want to know my view. But one argument is about the morale of people who are, fighting, against Hamas at present, which is to say, would they feel that the people, that the government they're fighting for, the state they're fighting for is going to have their back? Because if they don't feel that, then it affects their morale. It affects the way they relate to the work, to the service that they have to do. So that's one thing to note. Again, these are really hard questions, maybe even impossible dilemmas. But I think that really seeing them straight, for what they are, and being able to tell others, kind of what's happening, and be able to really show, not merely tell, but show this is what's happening. I think that's helpful stuff and can contribute to maybe a shifting of what we're seeing.
I think you raise a point, because for many people, the conflict presented is a very black and white narrative. Oppressor, the strong state of Israel versus oppressed, the innocent civilians in Gaza who are disempowered. And it's become a very simplified narrative, and people don't even believe that Israelis, that there are actual dilemmas that the government and the people have to contend with. To the extent that they see that there are dilemmas, they inevitably side with the people who are looking for their most emotional and immediate way to resolve their own things. In other words, the issue of hostages has become weaponized, not in a good way, and by the wrong people. And, aside from the Israelis, what they're going through, it's become almost a beacon of an argument to allow Hamas to basically prevail, and that's kind of, I want to end it on this. What do you think? How can we separate the need for this the sort of this natural human compassion for hostages, and the fact that this hostage narrative is also being used to kind of discredit Israel's military efforts and its security needs?
It's such an important question. I guess one thing that it's a great question. I think part of what we're sitting with as well is neither you nor I know what's possible. And in a way, no one does, because we live in history. I know I'm being very broad here, but we live in history, and actors at any given moment are making choices. Leaders are making choices, civilians, citizens, people around the world, we're making choices. And so, like, if one outcome is possible, that Hamas is out of power, and there's a pro-peace, pro-coexistence movement in Palestinian territories, if that's possible in the years ahead, then that's wonderful. That's a great thing. But maybe that's not possible, in which case what I would advocate for would be different. And again, we have, I can think about what everyone else thinks and believes and does and has done up till now, and then what I can do, what I have done. And, of course, I'm living my life. I also have to write this piece, and I also have to deal with my parents. And, it's like we're all busy doing our lives, right? So it's not all on me, but like, we have this opportunity to really think about our understanding of reality, and to reflect on our understanding of reality and our understanding of our own place within it. And I hope that each of us, as citizens of whatever countries we're in, from whatever faith traditions we have or don't have, like, to just think about what we can do and how we understand things, to not be afraid to see how, in a way, how horrible things are or can be, but also the ways that things are good or could be better with creativity and with intention. So I didn't answer so much the question about the hostages and exploiting morality and this ongoing situation, but I think that, like, I don't know who it was exactly, like, there's some quote about citizens banding together can do good, and I think that that's true, and I think that we just need to be clear-minded and realistic about what we're sitting with, and not just sit and watch the news, because that will just depress us, but really take a role, play a role. So thank you so much for your time, Irina, this evening. Really appreciate this really interesting conversation for me, frankly. So
thank you so much. I enjoyed it as well. You actually pointing out to sort of a Job's kind of response from God to mention Judaic studies. He did not necessarily get the point-by-point answer to his lamentations, but he did get an answer what he could and should be doing with his own time in terms of framing reality and basically, being grateful for what he did have in life.
And I think of that line, I know I keep saying good, it's a Jewish goodbye, maybe. It's like, there's this line, I think it's kind of Buddhist, don't just do something, sit there. I don't know if you're familiar with this line. It's playing on don't just sit there, do something. So it's this, I think it's a kind of an ongoing exploration of these issues about what's the right thing to do. Is it moral of me to be spending my time reading and writing articles, and ultimately, hopefully someone would read those articles and then go and do something with it. Maybe I need to be the one to, to save or to be involved with this situation on the ground, but, everyone with their skills and abilities, but we should jump in. I think that's another thing, is that, now is the time to do what we need to do, to explore what needs to be done, and to try to understand, and not to lie to ourselves or allow ourselves to be lied to, but to see things for what they are.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And for everyone watching the program, this was the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Stay tuned. We'll be back next Tuesday, 9 p.m. as usual. Thank you, Dr. Krug.
Thank you.